Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. George Floyd is the African-American man whose death in police custody on Monday, May 25th, has sparked national outrage, protests, and even violence. Derek Chauvin is the Minneapolis police officer who is alleged to have killed Mr. Floyd and has been arrested for his murder. Both of them worked for the same person in the same business at the same time. That business was called El Nuevo Rodeo, and the business owner for most of the time that they were both there was Maya Santamaria. She is a Latino community leader in Minneapolis who owns the largest Latino radio station in Minneapolis, St. Paul, called La Raza 1400 and 95.7 FM. She's also an artist and knows pretty much everyone, it seems, in South Minneapolis. Certainly has been very well connected there and knows what's going on now as business owners try to respond to a sort of anarchy situation, as she describes it. But she also knew George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, and she talks quite a bit about both of them. She talks about how Mr. Chauvin apparently used excessive force on numerous occasions, how he has done other things beyond just the George Floyd situation. And yes, she goes into some of that in some detail. She also describes how she believes that the institutions in Minneapolis are corrupt and even racist, and that there is a major tilt against certain ethnicities and ethnic institutions within Minneapolis city government. This is really interesting, and I haven't heard so much of this in this kind of detail reported elsewhere. So Mrs. Santamaria's observations are certainly worth listening to. She also talks about her feelings about President Trump and how she feels he is being received or thought of among the people of South Minneapolis. All in all, this is a fascinating interview at a very timely moment, when the discussions of how to deal with these complicated issues are only really just beginning. But right in the center of it all, in South Minneapolis, right in the middle, with her business being located on Lake Street and having burned to the ground in the last few days, is Maya Santamaria. And here is her interview. Joining me now is Maya Santamaria. She is the former owner of El Nuevo Rodeo and employed both George Floyd as well as Derek Chauvin, the police officer who is alleged to have killed Mr. Floyd. She's also the owner of La Raza 1400 and 95.7 FM, the largest Latino radio station in Minneapolis, as well as a performing artist and many other things. Ms. Santamaria, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you very much.
So I guess we should probably get to, of course, the primary topic that everyone is talking about, which is Mr. Floyd and Mr. Chauvin, who's alleged to have killed him, a member of the Minneapolis Police Department. They both worked for you. But before we get to that, I know from having talked to you as the former owner of El Nuevo Rodeo and a prominent Latina businesswoman in Minneapolis, that you've had a very, very difficult 24 to 48 hours, maybe a little longer than that. Could you just go over what's happened the last few days and your reaction to that, please?
Yes, I would have to say that I'm a little bit numb. We went from joining a peaceful protest to seeing our third precinct basically taken by the people. And then the second day, we started seeing that our buildings around the third precinct were being burnt to the ground. And they were being looted, they were being vandalized, the protests were continuing. And they successfully ran the police from the third precinct from the building of the third precinct. Then the next night, we suffered more damage to properties, more buildings being burnt. And I woke up that third morning finding out that our beautiful four-story historical building had been torched at about 4:20 in the morning.
Wow. You're talking about the building for El Nuevo Rodeo.
the building that contained El Nuevo Rodeo's 3 floors, other businesses as well, a historic Town Talk diner, a minority business that was just about to open. It was going to be a sports bar, Ace Cash Place, and La Raza, 95.7 FM and 1400 AM, studios and offices.
So let me ask you, obviously the building you're saying was torched, although you didn't own El Nuevo Rodeo any longer. You do operate this very large Latino radio station. Was there any loss incurred by the radio station?
It's a complete loss. The building at this moment is an empty shell. It's very unstable. And as a matter of fact, I'm worried about it falling over at this point. It's about to tip over. It is 4 floors. So there is no safety protection around the building, and people are mulling around and taking pictures and walking around. And I'm actually worried about the public safety right now around that building being unstable. There is no police protection in the area. It's been taken by the people, if you want to call it that. The community took it back, and the police are not anywhere to be found other than some of the riot police that are now trying to control the area at this time at 9:40 at night on the 4th day.
So I believe the governor sent in the National Guard, I think, to come in and help control the situation. I believe I read somewhere. As far as the police situation, you're mentioning that it really isn't heavily policed at this time, or that there's not police protection. What happens if somebody has an emergency, calls 911? I mean, is it just totally uncovered at this point, or what's the situation for residents there?
You cannot call 911 right now. You will not get service. You can call all you want, but you will not get anyone to come and assist you. You will, if your building is burning down, you will not get fire assistance. Our tax dollars are not at work. Everyone's building was on fire, and calling 911, and there was not a police to be found anywhere for the whole day, the whole night, for 3 days. It was complete pandemonium, and it continued and continued. I think the last number I saw, which is probably obsolete now, was 147 buildings burnt around Lake Street.
Wow.
Which, what I want to explain to your viewers or your audience, if you're not from Minneapolis, this was a vibrant commercial boulevard. It housed the majority of the ethnic businesses in the entire state. It was a multicultural area where immigrants could come in and start their very interesting businesses. There were malls full of dozens and dozens of ethnic businesses on the street. There were a lot of historic buildings, the historic commercial corridor for Minneapolis, where it all started in a certain time. That's why in our building we had a Art Deco sign that was registered with the historic registrar. And I wrote on my Facebook page, Maya Santamaria, I wrote an ode to this building because I owned it for many years. I was in it for over 17 years. And I know a lot about its history, and I know that it is a crying shame we lost one of the last surviving Oddfellows buildings in the country. There are very few left, especially ones as beautiful and significant as this one was. And mine isn't the only one, unfortunately. The Coliseum building across the street from us got torched. It's not falling, and it may be recoverable. Mine is absolutely not recoverable. All 4 floors are completely burnt because it was a wood structure with just a brick exterior. There was a historic ballroom there. I could go on and on and on, but it's a crying shame. That was the heart of the Latino community. That was the center where all of the big artists came, and the dances happened, and the couples met, and the babies were baptized, and the weddings happened, and the radio station was there. What can I say? It was the heartbeat of the community. And we know that it was people that were not Minnesotans and that were not Minneapolis residents that were doing this destruction. And it's extremely traumatizing for all of us. We're all walking around the area, and it's like a war zone.
So let's talk about that. Why do you think that protesters targeted this particular area for destruction and rioting over the last few days? And I guess I should probably add to that, Ms. Santamaria, is the riot, is the violence continuing at this hour. It's about 10 o'clock Central Time on Saturday evening as we record this. Is there still a lot going on in that area, or has it largely calmed down? But why did they start there, and then what's the situation now?
It started on Lake Street because the third precinct was on Lake and 26th, and our building was like on Lake and 27th. So it was all about taking the precinct, and they did it. They were successful, and the mayor decided to tell the cops to withdraw. And that was a peaceful gesture. He didn't want the police officers to go and start shooting people. And so he chose life. He chose peace, and he decided to just hand it over to the rioters and the protesters and
when was
withdraw.
Well, that's pretty extraordinary, Miss Santamaria, and I haven't heard that anywhere else. So the killing occurred on Monday the 25th, correct? And
Correct.
these demonstrations began, I think, on Tuesday. Wednesday got really bad over the last few days.
Wednesday, we took over the third precinct.
Okay.
I say we because it was supposedly all the protesters. And the first day I was in on it, not the second day.
So really Wednesday, the precinct, you're saying the mayor just kind of said,
let them have it.
Let them have it. So
it's not worth hurting someone or someone getting shot.
Police drew, but that was because you're saying that was Derek Chauvin's precinct.
It was. It was the precinct of the 4 officers that are in question.
Okay, so that is the yes, and there are we should point out 3 other officers who are potentially implicated in this, although I don't believe at this hour any charges have actually been filed on any of those 3 individuals at this time.
That's correct. They've only taken Derek Chauvin into custody. Now, last night we were relatively confident that that was going to kind of be it, and the protests would resume maybe Saturday peacefully. That was today. That was the plan, but it got out of hand again the third day, and that was when my building was set ablaze, and many others. But today, Mayor Carter of St. Paul released a piece of information that had everyone really upset today, and that is that the majority, and he said all, but he's since corrected himself, the majority of the people that have been apprehended for property destruction since then were not from Minnesota. They were out of state people that had arrived, that had descended upon Minnesota.
Wow.
In order to destroy, maybe there are people that are anarchists and they're arsonists, and they maybe belong to groups that want to create havoc and anarchy in communities like this, but they were not local community people. And so it didn't hurt them to destroy these little family businesses. A local person, I don't think emotionally would have the capacity to do that to our fellow people.
So you're saying this is very interesting, and I apologize to press on this, but I really, I kind of am curious now, because you're saying that this flashpoint, this precinct where Derek Chauvin and the other 3 officers implicated in this killing of George Floyd, really this has been the locus for activity from outside of the state, and people are coming from outside of not just Minneapolis, St. Paul, but outside of the state to create anarchy is the word I think you used in this area. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's extremely heartbreaking, because the people that are most affected are minorities, immigrants, people that don't have a lot of resources. A lot of them didn't even have insurance, I hate to report.
Right.
And their lives are decimated now from this.
So who, Ms. Santamaria, who is it that is actually perpetrating the riots and the violence? I mean, just as one person, although certainly a prominent business person there, as well as somebody that communicates not just with the Latino community, but all of that South Minneapolis area. Who do you believe is actually responsible for the violence and the riots and so forth that's been getting so much coverage there in Minneapolis?
There are a lot of theories, Jeff. But I can tell you that the majority of the people that I have personally found out about, heard about, seen, reported on have been Anglo-Saxon. They have not been African American. They have not been Latino. They have not been of another race. And some of them seem to be white supremacist groups.
Have you seen any markings or flags or anything that have indicated white supremacy groups in what you've seen?
Yes, actually, one of the community organizers that I was speaking to, that is one of the most important nonprofits on Lake Street, and one of the foundations in Minneapolis, were telling me that on Facebook they were announcing that they had arrived in Minneapolis. But what I've seen specifically is stickers on cars. Aside from being license plates that were from out of town, they had particular stickers that were identified as white supremacist groups. Particular markings on their clothes, so being dressed in black, but then having a red armband and white laces on their boots. So these are the kind of markers that people are talking about. I'm not an expert on white supremacist groups or anarchist groups or Antifas or any of these kind of groups that people are talking about. I don't, specialize in that kind of thing, but this is what's starting to come out. And we don't know if it's in order to make it look like it was, the African American movement doing it, but really it was the opposite. We don't know, but we certainly know that these people seem to take a lot of pleasure and enjoyment in absolutely burning Minneapolis to the ground.
So I don't want to ask you to speculate on this, Ms. Santamaria, without knowing, although you mentioned a couple of things that are kind of across the spectrum. So white supremacy groups, I think most people would generally say that's on the far, far right wing. And then you mentioned Antifa, which is, I think, a far, far left wing anarchist group. Are you saying that really extremists from all over the spectrum appear to be taking advantage of this opportunity or trying to for their own gain? Or do you think that there's any particular focus here, or as far as the folks that are coming in from outside?
I haven't been able to hear any logical references as to a real organized kind of effort by one group. It almost seems like it's various things at once.
Wow.
But I can tell you that it's people from out of town, most definitely.
Wow.
And right now, we local Minnesotans are on a curfew. The mayors have declared curfews in both metro areas, and anyone who's local is expected to stay put inside their homes or their businesses if they're defending their businesses. And we'll get to that because I want to get to that point.
Yeah.
But the idea behind that is not to punish Minnesotans or to restrict our freedoms. The idea of that is that then those left in the streets protesting cannot hide behind us as human shields. So they'll be exposed. And then that's who the National Guard and the State Patrol can come in and encircle and apprehend.
Are local residents respecting the curfew?
As far as I know, yes, because we all did a campaign today and telling everyone we need to respect this curfew. Now, there were some protests around 7, 8 o'clock, but what we saw was that the local, and there were a lot of the Black community and the South Minneapolis community, but when the curfew moment came and the announcement to leave came, the locals sat down in a gesture of passive, somewhere between obedience and resistance, right? They were like, well, we're here, we're not in curfew, but we're sitting down. Our arms are up. We're not doing anything. We're not looting.
So I want to come back around to this. So just so I can point this out, because what you just said, I think is an important point. You're saying that there are local protesters from the Black community, but they're not, as far as you can see, engaged in the violence. It's these folks from outside of Minnesota. Is that correct?
That is correct. Okay. I can verify.
Okay.
With everyone I know in the Black community, the leaders, none of them are engaged in anything violent or destructive against our own communities of color.
Right.
And Omar Ilan came out, our senator, to talk very vehemently about that just now, saying these are our communities of color. Our people of color are not coming and destroying our own people's, our own brothers and uncles' businesses. This is not. Right.
So Representative Ilhan Omar, she represents that area in the federal Congress, and you're saying she came out and was kind of reassuring folks. And so, okay, I want to come back to all of that, but I do want to jump a little bit and talk about Mr. Floyd and Mr. Chauvin, because obviously this has been attracting an enormous amount of tension. You've been quoted in several news stories that are trying to understand the relationship between the men, but I haven't seen a longer form interview with you where this has been explored. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then you can kind of give me a little bit more of a detailed answer that I guess hasn't been captured elsewhere. So starting off, you employed both Derek Chauvin and George Floyd over the past several years. Could you describe that relationship in terms of yourself as an employer at El Nuevo Rodeo?
Sure. I want to just make sure that it's clear that I, in no uncertain terms, want to imply that these two knew each other, had a working relationship, or the contrary, that they had a beef, because
Sure.
that I don't think that that would be a fair representation.
Sure.
Derek Chauvin, as my off-duty police officer, and really the head of my police officers that worked with me for the better part of 17 years, um, was outside in his patrol car. His job description was to be going around the club and making sure that as patrons entered and exited the building, they were safe, that everybody was good, and that nobody was robbing them or breaking into their cars, that kind of situation. If there was somebody inside that needed to be removed, if we found some kind of illegal thing on them, something of that nature, we could hand that person or those things over to him, and we don't have to call 911. He would be there handy for us to hand over to law enforcement, because we weren't law enforcement. Now, we did have inside security guards, and the club was the restaurant on the first floor, and then the second floor was the very big club, and then the third floor was an event center that was slightly smaller. So the security agents would roam, most of them, between the three floors. Some would have the doors, some would be in backstage dealing with the artists and the promoters and the crowds wanting to get their pictures taken with the artists. And so you can imagine that if you are working the backstage and you're with the crowds, you have no idea what the police officer outside is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be very little overlap, unless you happen to be that one security guard who was removing a patron and was going up to the officer and saying, here you go, this guy did this, that, or the other, take him in, or whatever. Then that would be really the only, reasonable way that they might interact.
Sure.
So they probably crossed paths on their way to my office to get paid at some point, but that doesn't mean that they knew each other.
Right. Would it have been common for individuals who were working, interacting in that precinct, in that area of town? I mean, you mentioned it's a concentrated community of ethnic businesses earlier. I mean, would it have been common for just any two people being in that area to have crossed paths on a regular basis?
Yeah, but I think that also the police officers see themselves a little bit removed from people from the hood.
Okay.
So there's kind of two groups, right? There's us and there's them, and that's kind of how it feels.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Mr. Floyd, and then I want to ask you about Derek Chauvin. So George Floyd worked for you as a bouncer, is that right?
I'd never use the word bouncer. We would use security guard or security agent.
Security guard. That was, folk, forgive me, and that was what was in some of the articles about this. They used
I'm sure.
bouncer, but you're saying he was a security guard, and he was inside the club.
He would be inside the club.
Okay.
And just to clarify, he didn't work full time for me.
Okay.
He had a different job during the weekends.
Okay.
When I could have used him most, I couldn't use him. So I would need to call him in if I needed extra support during the week. We had an urban night on Tuesday nights.
Right. So, so Mr. Floyd worked for you part-time inside as a security guard. And how many years did he work for you?
I only remember him coming around the last year or so. And again, I wouldn't hire them. My head of security would hire our extra staff.
Okay.
So,
but you knew all the individuals that were on your team, and you kind of knew these folks on some level, I'm sure.
Some of them, if they didn't work a long time for me or consistently for me, it was more just like, hi, how you doing? Right. Make sure you stand here all night. Don't move. Okay, bye. Thanks.
Sure. So what were your interactions with Floyd? Did you get to know him at all?
Just hi, and he was a really nice guy and always had something sweet to say, and that was about it. We didn't have any personal conversations. It was strictly professional and just kind of, the greetings and things like that.
Right, right. So, I mean, obviously, in the sense of those that want to maybe criticize or let's say defend the actions of the officers, they would say, you know, the report was that he was resisting police. Did you ever get any sense that Mr. Floyd was someone that would resist police in any way, or was that kind of a person, or?
Is there a kind of person that resists? I think we would all resist under
Fair enough.
different circumstances.
Okay.
Um, what I do want to tell you is that I just saw, that last video that leaked, where you can see three guys kind of what looks like they're kneeling on him.
Right.
I hadn't seen the first part of that video, the earlier part of it. I just saw that right before we started this podcast, and it to me it seemed like maybe he was for the first time. I thought maybe he was, but so what? You don't kill a guy for that.
Right. No. So, well,
You take him into jail.
Well, I guess
and
what I'm
tell it
trying
to the judge.
Sure. What I'm trying to clarify, though, as somebody that was at least around him somewhat, you did not see him as a violent person, as a criminal person. I mean, you didn't get that sense that, I mean, he worked for you as a security guard.
Yeah. No, I didn't.
And he
No.
did he do, as far as you know, a reasonably good job at that?
He was great. He was a really good security guard. I mean, if he didn't have a steady job at my friend's club, that we might have used him on a regular basis.
Right.
He already had a job.
Right. So, okay, now let's talk about Derek Chauvin, because you knew him quite a bit better. And you're saying maybe for the better part of 17 years, he was really your go-to guy in terms of outside security. Is that right?
Well, in the beginning, there was somebody that was older and senior to him that started and brought him in. And then when that gentleman moved to a different precinct and got a promotion, he kind of started saying, just deal directly with Chauvin and he'll take over.
Right. So,
So that was about halfway in.
Okay. So in terms of, how that worked, would you have these gentlemen outside or the persons that were on the police staff, whoever they were, they would be in their car, in their police car outside of your club, or would they be in a personal vehicle?
They use police patrol cars.
Police patrol vehicles. Okay. So in terms of, how that kind of worked, you mentioned earlier, if there was somebody that was trying to get in and shouldn't have been, or there was something that was maybe a fight broke out. I mean, what were the occasions that you can recall when Mr. Chauvin had to directly deal with maybe a violent or a confrontational situation? I'm sure you probably saw some things like that.
I did, but I'm, I have to be honest. It's all kind of a blur because it was a lot of years.
Right.
And I wasn't always outside, vigiling him. I was oftentimes in the office paying the promoters, or backstage with the artists. And so I wasn't always watching, but I did hear a lot of things. And I did, at times manage to walk outside and see him apprehending people. And I remember that through the years, there were times when I really either wanted to talk to him about treating people better or did talk to him about it. Because I also remember being frustrated that I would forget to say things to him that I wanted to tell him. But there were times when I would pull him aside and say, that's too much. Why are you just pepper spraying people all the time? You should actually apprehend the people that are fighting and not pepper spray innocent people that have nothing to do with it. So there were times I would have to kind of have words with him.
Okay, so hold on a second, Ms. Santamaria. So you were saying there are more than one occasion, sounds like multiple occasions, when Mr. Chauvin went too far by your judgment.
Yes.
Was there a specific instance that you can recall that was maybe above some of the others, or just comes to mind that he went a little bit too far?
I can't recall exactly, like, let's say, watching him hold someone too much, but I remember thinking that I had seen it. So I can't visualize it, but I can remember making a mental note, like, God, I got to talk to him about doing that.
But you did talk to him about using excessive force or being excessive with people. So pepper spray, you mentioned, other tactics that you felt went too far that you saw with Mr. Chauvin?
Well, there's an issue that it depends on also what night it was.
Sure.
and what clientele was in the club that night.
Okay. Could you explain a little bit about that?
So the first gentleman that started working the beat, and Chauvin, who was kind of his second guy, right-hand guy, and a couple of the other officers, they started working with me in the beginning when it was strictly a Latino club and we didn't work with any other communities. And I think they thought it was going to be like a really rough club in the beginning, but we kind of got to the point where we had a mutual understanding. And I think they really enjoyed working the Latin nights and enjoyed the Latino community. And I worked really hard training my staff so that they understood culturally also how to deal with our community when maybe we have had a little bit too much to drink, or maybe we are upset or jealous that somebody looked at our girlfriend or whatever. There's a way to communicate with people to de-escalate the situation. And I trained a lot in that because we were regular clientele and I wanted them to come back the next weekend. And so you have to treat them like people and not just like, expendable pieces of meat.
So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chauvin was trained to deal with situations like this, you say, with the Latino community, and to deal with, situations that maybe escalate. You've trained him in that respect.
No, I'm talking about my security guards. So then when we would hand them over, or there was an altercation and the police got out of their cars and would have to come in and deal with the situation, they knew how I was. They knew how I like things done. So I think they tried, but they were much more hardlined, and they didn't have that sweet spot in their heart, and they didn't have the business sense of worrying about whether someone was going to give me a good review on Yelp the next day. So I got a lot of complaints, through the years about that guy is a XYZ explicative, that cop is this and that cop is that. Lots of good dirty words to explain the cop, and not only him. And I don't want to just point him out; it was him and others.
Sure.
So through the years, I got those, that the cops were overly rough with the clientele and whatnot. But then towards the end of my career with the club, we started doing some urban nights. And I think that's a politically correct way of calling an African-American night, right? So we would do these urban nights on Tuesdays. Some Black promoters came in. They didn't have anywhere else in town to do their events because the city of Minneapolis and licensing doesn't like Black people to have their clubs and to have their events and places where they can actually practice their culture and do their kind of, dancing and hip hop music and things they like to do. And so it was a conscious decision that I made, knowing that, licensing wasn't going to love me for it. I said, we have to open up this space to all communities. And this is their hood, and they need to be able to have a right to have their shows and their events. And the minute I started allowing some of these promoters, and they were all good professional promoters, the minute they started doing shows with me, the minute the promotion would come out, I would get calls from licensing. I would get calls from the city. I would get calls from the 3rd Precinct. And they just really didn't like me having Black people on my promotion. This Black artist, this Black man, these 2 Black ladies, whoever it is, are coming into my club. All of a sudden, the race factor grew exponentially against me with the authorities.
So I want to get back to Derek Chauvin, but I'm just going to ask you directly. You're saying that the city of Minneapolis is institutionally racist in a lot of the things it does.
Yeah, if what I'm describing to you sounds like institutional racism, yeah.
I mean, you're saying in licensing, African-American clubs, artists, promoters were discounted versus other ethnic groups and Anglo and Latino clubs and so forth.
Yeah, they didn't have anywhere else to go because they were being kicked out everywhere. Now, there were problems in other clubs. Aqua had a shooting one night and they closed them down and things like that. And some of it was justified and some of it was just fear. So I took a gamble and we never had a problem. But boy, did I have all of these phone calls and meetings and sit downs where I was forced to make security plans and submit them for approval and ask and submit flyers for approval and ask if I could even have the shows. I mean, I didn't have to do that for shows.
Wow. So do you believe that the police department, and maybe this is a good segue back to Mr. Chauvin, do you believe the police department of Minneapolis is institutionally racist against African American citizens?
It sure felt like it when I was, going to bat for the African American community. It felt very racist and it was ugly.
Could you describe, besides your own club, maybe some ways that you saw that it was, as you say, ugly, or that it was really bad?
Well, none of the off-duty police officers really wanted to work those nights. And I'm going to tell you about a situation that really disturbed me. And that is that we not only did African American nights, but we did African nights. And the African clientele was just a wonderful group of people to work with. I enjoyed their clientele. I enjoyed their promoters. And I really think that it's a lovely community. And so when they had events, they weren't violent at all. They were very peaceful and loving, and they just wanted to have a good time. And one night we had a miscommunication because one promoter kind of passed the event onto another promoter, which they're not supposed to do. And everything got out on social media, and I got a bunch of kids that night that weren't of age to get in. And so it was kind of a miscommunication that, it wasn't communicated how old you had to be to get into the club on social media. So I had about 100 East African kids, very attractive, cool kids that were out in front of the club. And I can't remember, I want to think Chauvin was there that night because he was almost there every night. But by the time I got there, I showed up a little late. By the time I got there, there were like 6 squad cars out front. And I'm thinking to myself, what the heck happened? Apparently these kids were raising their voice because they were told they could get in and they wanted to get in and they couldn't get in. And they were kind of maybe telling a few stories that weren't true, that they had already bought tickets when nobody bought pre-sale tickets for that event. But other than that, it wasn't to me a bad scenario. I didn't think there was anything bad going on. Everyone I spoke to was respectful. They might raise their voice a little, but I understood they were worked up. And Latinos, we raise our voice too when we're excited, so that doesn't bother me. And I walked up to the police officers, and they were all worked up, and they were ready to start, throwing down on these kids. They were looking like this was some kind of violent situation, that they needed to get almost violent with these kids already and start arresting them. And I was asking them, what is going on? Everything's fine. These kids they're sweethearts. You just got to talk to them and explain the situation. It was out of hand. The cops were out of hand. They were gearing up. They were looking like, they were in some kind of terrorist situation, and they weren't.
Do you remember specifically when that was?
I can't remember the date, but it was in the last year. It was 2019. It showed the racism. The racism was clear to me. If that was a group of white kids outside, or maybe even a group of Mexican kids, they wouldn't have had all those squad cars out there. All the kids were doing was sitting in line.
So let's go back to Mr. Chauvin. He was a Minneapolis police officer. That word for a Houston guy, that can be a little long sometimes. So in his work with you over that many years, you said you recall times he used excessive force, went too far. You had to maybe deal with some situations with him. Although you can't recall every situation, it's a blur, and obviously last week has been a difficult week for you. But do you remember any times with Mr. Chauvin that you saw him using anything that you would consider to be racist language, or acting in a racially charged way, or displaying racially charged behavior towards your clients or anyone else outside of the club when he was working or at any other time?
No, because in Minnesota, we know how to be Minnesota nice. And so we know how to not say racist things, but imply racist things, but sound politically correct the whole time we're saying them. So the cops know enough to, not use words they're not supposed to use, but it's implied. And
so let me ask you in a different way. Do you believe that Mr. Chauvin had any innate sense of racial bias in doing his job?
I think he was afraid of African American men. I don't think he was a racist. He was married to an Asian lady. He liked our Latino community. He enjoyed working our beat. But when it came to those urban events, they didn't want. He was a smaller statue stature gentleman, slimmer guy. And so I think that he was just intimidated and didn't want to be put in the position where he might have to break up a fight between 5, 6 big African American guys and be in that situation.
But were there any particular incidents that you recall with Mr. Chauvin that gave you the sense that he was even implying something that would be racist or anything like that?
Not strictly directly racist, but they don't like working the black clubs. I think they don't want to be involved with the black knights, and that's I think my cat's trying to photobomb here. I don't think that is a clientele they want to work with. I think that's kind of more what it is.
So let me ask you about the leadership of the city. The mayor, Jacob Fry, 4 days ago, he said, I think in a press conference, that it was, quote, completely and utterly messed up, and has expressed seemingly a great deal of compunction for the death of George Floyd. Do you believe him? Do you think he's being sincere, or is he maybe backtracking? I mean, is his compunction sincere, or is he part of this institutional problem that you were describing?
Mayor Fry just came into the picture in the last couple of years. He's really cool. I know him in person. He's one of us. He's a local Minnesota person. And let me tell you something else about Minnesotans. We are progressive racially. I'm talking about the people. We're progressive. The Latinos and the whites and the blacks and everybody, the Hmong people, we all work together in our organizations, in our networking, in our friend groups, in our parties, in our in everything we want to do in our work. We all work really well. This is the state where we have the largest percentage of black and white people marrying. It's a very racially progressive state in that sense, at least the cities, right? Let's get this to the metro area, shall we? And so that's where the anger and the frustration comes from with these protests, when our police department in our city are so out of whack. So Jacob Fry is our mayor now, but we're talking about a system that predates him.
So
he's progressive.
So you have positive marks for Mayor Fry. You believe he's wanting.
I believe him.
Correct.
I believe him. Yep. He speaks truth. I think he represents us. Yeah.
So in terms of the other three officers involved in the Floyd situation, what do you think about them? Do you think that they are also complicit? I mean, should they be charged in your view? There's obviously discussion about whether or not they will be charged as well. Mr. Chauvin has been charged, I believe, with murder in this situation, and there's an FBI inquiry as well that has been opened up. But what do you think about the remainder of the officers that were working on that fateful day?
Everyone I know, everyone that's been at the protest, everyone I've spoken to wants all four to be arrested and convicted. Even the gentleman that was standing there watching, I mean, he was accomplice to the acts. He could have stopped them.
So what do you think should have been done by, let's say that one of them had been morally opposed to what was going on? I mean, what could, or maybe what would have the protesters and those who are so upset about this and outraged and are going out and demonstrating, what would have been the preferred outcome maybe for one of those individuals nearby, one of the other officers, to have stopped what was going on when Derek Chauvin was kneeling on the neck of George Floyd?
When I watch that video, I sit there and in my mind, I'm telling agent or officer two, the Hmong officer, in my mind, I'm telling him, go stop him. Stop him. He should have walked over and he should have said, that's enough. You've gone too far. Let him up. Let's go. Let's put him in the car and let's take him in. Get up.
So you obviously have experience with the police, not only having employed the police, but also being a leader in the community there. I mean, are there other incidents that predate? I mean, George Floyd is right now, everyone's talking about George Floyd. Obviously, before George Floyd, everyone was talking about the Ahmaud Arbery situation from Georgia, another really, really sad and unfortunate killing, although the police were not the ones that chased down and killed Ahmaud Arbery, to be clear. But in that community there in South Minneapolis, the racially diverse area where Derek Chauvin and these others have worked, do you believe that there are other instances in the past where excessive force have been used and maybe they just got away with it or it wasn't noticed?
I think it happens all the time, and I think it's not just at the hands of Derek Chauvin. I know that Derek has about 18 complaints about him with the city of Minneapolis for mishandling situations and being overly violent with people. I'm trying to get a young man to speak out who got his arm broken by Chauvin about 5 days earlier before the death of George Floyd. But you know, I used to say that Chauvin was one of the better cops, so I don't know where that takes us.
Okay, so Miss Maya Santamaria, Latino community leader, as well as radio station owner and the owner of El Nuevo Radio, you're saying that Derek Chauvin broke someone's arm 5 days before the Floyd incident. And
I am trying to get that young man to step forward. He's kind of, in the words of someone I know, he's kind of hood, so he doesn't want to step out and talk. But I think it would be important for this young gentleman to speak up. So I'm going to try to see if I can. He's not a direct friend of mine. I'm going to try to see if I can get to talk to him about it.
So this was this was an African American young man?
Yes, mixed. Mm-hmm.
So do you think, I mean, I don't want to harp on this point too much, but I think it's important because you ran a primarily Latina business with the nightclub, but you did have nights where you say a lot of the clientele were African American. But do you believe Mr. Chauvin, was his issue with kind of everyone? Was he just, did he just not like any person of color? Was it particularly African Americans that he seemed to have a problem with, or?
It was more the Black nights because he liked the Latino nights, and he obviously enjoyed, being married to a beautiful Asian woman, Hmong woman to be specific, for 10 years. So it was, I think, the African American presence that got these officers in the third precinct always very nervous. They always had to call for backup, spray everybody with pepper spray. It was just this reoccurring thing where it's not necessary. I wasn't afraid in those situations, and I'm unarmed, and I'm a woman, and I could go up to a situation and de-escalate it by listening to people and talking to them and giving them customer service and listening to what their problem was.
Why do you think? Was there anything that you knew from Mr. Chauvin's past that gave him any particular inclination or that caused him to maybe have that tendency towards excessive use of force?
I think that's probably the work for a psychoanalyst.
Well, I want to ask you about the business situation. You alluded to a couple of things with regards to that and the situation of the last several days. However, is there anything you wanted to specifically say about Derek Chauvin or George Floyd before we move back to that topic?
George should be alive today. Mm-hmm. The fact that Minneapolis does care about race relations and does want to support the Black community and all minority communities. I mean, we've seen this huge turnout. It's a crying shame that things got out of hand and that the people that got affected were mostly minority people and people that don't have resources and are suffering right now. And I want to underline that fact that right now what's left from the rubble now that we're in the process of burying George, today there was a memorial service for him with balloons and things like that. And we're going through that grieving process. We can't bring him back. But what we can do for George is, put our city back together and rebuild it.
So you mentioned business owners earlier protecting their businesses, and it sounded like you had some more to say about that. Could you please elaborate?
I was invited to a meeting today, and it was an impromptu grassroots meeting of many of the Latino business owners up and down Lake Street. And I had never seen something quite like this in my community. They had to discuss how to protect themselves tonight from having their buildings burned down and being looted again because they'd all been looted. I think without exception, every person there, and there were probably 80 business people there, they had all been looted and pillaged. And, you know, it was a horrible situation. Everything's boarded up, but they were, some of them apparently have arms and some don't. Some were trying to locate pepper spray. Everyone was handed a mask. And I heard conversations about we have to make our own Latino security force on Lake Street to protect our businesses. And if you have to use an arm to defend your business, if they're coming into your business, then I guess that's what we're going to have to do. And there were conversations about don't shoot at people, shoot at the ground away from the people, scare them off. We're not trying to kill anybody or hurt anybody, but we have to protect our businesses. And people are organizing. They're going to be walking around tonight. They're going to be defending their businesses, and it's a full Latino security impromptu group of business owners that are going to take charge of their own destiny because the police are not securing us.
Oh, wow. So that really is something. So Latino business owners have organized their own police force because the Minneapolis Police Department has completely pulled out of the area.
And it's not really a police force. It's more like, you know, what would the word be? I mean, these are people that come from Mexico and Guatemala. We have to, you know, this is an indigenous kind of way of organizing and protecting your land. Well, in the city, you protect your business and your property.
Right.
So,
right.
You know, it's more like a warrior thing.
But they are, but these are individuals who are armed and they are ready to do what's necessary to protect their businesses.
Some of the men are armed and some are women just like me. And they're just out there and they don't know how they're going to do it. But they're going to grab a bat or some pepper spray or a broken bottle or a brick or whatever they can find, and they're going to defend their businesses.
So what does that say to you? I mean, as you know, in America, obviously, there's a sense of having fair institutions and the rule of law and a police that is there to protect businesses. And yet citizens of South Minneapolis, in the wake of this tragic event, are losing their businesses. You have people, it sounds like from out of state, maybe, that, according to you, out of staters that are coming in and rioting and looting and burning. And so these business owners are taking matters into their own hands and have to go out and take arms into their own hands and actually defend their businesses. How does that make you feel?
First of all, where's our tax dollars at work? We can't call 911 and ask anybody in uniform to help us right now. And we're watching our historic, iconic buildings burn with our businesses inside of them. My radio station is off the air right now. We've been off the air since Tuesday night because we've been, you know, completely attacked. It's starting, and let me be clear, there is almost no food in the barrio right now, okay? It's hard to access food. All of the markets have been pillaged. All of the restaurants are closed. Where do you get food? Okay, people are getting hungry. And some of the women I was talking to, they don't have a car. They don't have a driver's license. Where are you going to get food? Target and Kmart are burnt down. Cup Foods is burnt down.
Target
Walgreens is burnt down.
Target and Kmart are burnt down.
Yes, sir. This is where we get our food in the neighborhood.
How many individuals do you think are in this population affected by this?
Thousands. 147 buildings burnt. In some of those buildings, it was various buildings, and these are family businesses. And if you didn't get your building burnt, and you were lucky enough, you're afraid that you're next. So you're on the defense, and you're not going to sleep tonight. We were talking about not sleeping tonight. No one's sleeping tonight because they're going to be standing guard.
Wow.
This is not the city of Minneapolis that I know.
So you mentioned Mayor Fry, you believe is you said one of us, is somebody that cares about your concerns. I mean, what would your appeal be to him to deal with this?
You know, it's hard to criticize. These are new mayors. Both Mayor Fry and Mayor Carter are young, new mayors. And even the older, seasoned mayors have never dealt with anything like this. And on top of it all, we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? Double whammy. So I want to give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt. But if I'm going to criticize anything, it's, and the governor is included in this, it's a day late and a penny short, because now all the troops are coming in to quote unquote protect us. Everything's gone. Everything's burned down. We've lost everything. It's too late. It got out of hand, and there should have been some kind of executive decision to pull resources from all the little towns and all the suburbs and all the areas and the state patrols and the sheriffs and all the people we have in the state, and focused on that neighborhood and taking control. How is it that, why can't White Bear Lakes Police Department come and help me with my burning building in Minneapolis? Why can't Egan's Police Department, Eden Prairie's, these are cities 20 minutes away. Why can't they come in to help? There was no coordination. At some point, it was absolutely a complete loss of control.
Ms. Santamaria, I want to ask you about a communication from President Donald Trump, where he tweeted the other day, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. He later said his comments had been misconstrued. Quote, frankly, it means when there's looting, people get shot and they die, he said. What do people in South Minneapolis, in the heart of this protest that Mr. Trump was referring to, President Trump was referring to, what do they believe about that? I mean, are they concerned about what the president said? Are they fans of the president's? What's the reaction to what Mr. Trump is doing?
I think it's safe to say that everybody that has been protesting and waging this war against police brutality and racism are not Trump supporters, needless to say. And when he starts talking about shooting people, before we realize that some of them were probably not local people, that's relatively new news. People here in Minneapolis took that to mean that, he'd be fine with coming and shooting our people, which is just a larger extension of the cops wanting to shoot our people. So of course that's taken very poorly, and we find that offensive. And frankly, Minneapolis doesn't want the federal forces here taking over our streets.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's probably a relevant follow-up there, too. Ms. Santamaria, as far as federal response goes, if President Trump were to try and deploy additional military security to South Minneapolis, that certainly is not unprecedented for the president to do that in situations where violence is occurring of this sort. Is that something that it doesn't sound like South Minneapolis would welcome?
South Minneapolis would not welcome that kind of federal presence here, but at the same time, we're all beginning to realize that it's necessary to do something to take back control of the streets, because it's gotten out of hand, and forces that we don't really know who they are beginning to come in and rape and completely pillage our city, and we can't allow that to happen anymore. So you see a dynamic now where a lot of the people who are, thoughtful, reasonable people that were, protesting in the beginning, we're now starting to say, we're not going to protest. We're going to get everyone off the streets so that we can expose these actors and try to figure out who they are for our own protection and safety.
Right. And you mentioned, of course, Latino business owners going out and protecting their property and taking up arms and patrolling the streets even. I mean, do you trust the police right now in Minneapolis? Do people in that area trust the police?
No, they're shooting at us with maybe not necessarily with their rifles, but they're shooting at us with canisters of gas. They're shooting at us with rubber bullets and pellets. And so the relationship is still one of animosity. We have a lot of healing to do. I've been asking, where is Arredondo? I think he just emerged today for the first time in a while. Arredondo is our Black chief of police, and he has not been vocal. He hasn't been present. He should be leading this. And when we got an African American police chief, I was ecstatic. And we had him come and talk on our radio station. And we were very excited that he was going to hopefully lead us into a new era of police relations with the community. And with all of this, happening and going down, he's been silent. I don't know what's going on. There must be something political going on. I hope he doesn't have to step down or be fired after this situation, but I find it extremely odd that he's been completely out of the public view.
So the answer is no. Folks in that community do not trust the Minneapolis police. Do you trust the city government?
I do. I trust both Mayor Carter. I trust Mayor Fry. I like Governor Walz. And I think that that's going to be the leadership that is going to be healing for us right now. We have great people on the city council. We have a wonderful representative in Ilan Omar. We have wonderful representatives in Patricia Torres Gray. A lot of our wonderful representatives are great leaders that can lead us toward this healing and this institutional change and progress that we need. It's just that we need it now. And right now, what we have is all kinds of state troops and National Guard storming our streets, trying to, shoot at people with rubber pellets. So that we're in a state of war, like I've been saying for the last 3 days, in the streets of Minneapolis. And we have a lot of healing and a lot of work to do. And let's not forget that this isn't only in the city of Minneapolis. Let's remember that I think there are close to 9 or 10 cities right now going through the exact same thing, maybe in smaller percentages or dimensions, but this has become a national thing, and we need national healing. And Minneapolis isn't the only city where there are racial tensions and problems with the police and race. So really, it's a national discussion. As long as we have Donald Trump in office as a president, we're not going to be able to do that work.
Yeah, so Houston, here where I am, I mean, is certainly one of the most racially diverse cities in the nation, and there have been demonstrations here as well. Although I don't think that the level of violence, frankly, or the riot factor has been as high, nearly as high as in other places, such as in Minneapolis. So you mentioned President Trump again. I suppose going down the list then of talking about trust and talking about leadership, do you feel like, President Trump has provided or can provide leadership, in your view, to help through this crisis? Or what would you, if not, then where would you say he needs to go in order to do that for reassuring the folks in that community?
Yeah, so talking about shooting isn't probably going to get us anywhere right now, because we're going to go on the defense, right? Because they're talking about shooting our people. We need to start talking about how we can make institutional change. And that's where it's going to start. That's where the healing is going to start. And it's also hard to do that when you have, frankly, and you're in Texas, you know all about this, white racist people on the inside leading a lot of the institutions. So that's our challenge. Not that we have anything against white people, but we have something against racist people. And what Trump has brought to the limelight and to the forefront, that was something that I actually honestly didn't realize was such a predominant thing in our country, is that there are still a lot of very racist people in this country that are outwardly racist, that belong to organizations like the KKK and white supremacist groups. And that's still a reality in this country in 2020. And so that's something that is, going to be part of our national dynamic for quite a while here, while we realize that we've got kind of two different factions in our country. We've got part of the country that thinks that that's okay, and the other part of the country that says this has got to end. This is not okay, and it can't happen anymore.
And one of the interesting things, and you mentioned this, but Madaria Arredondo, who is the chief of police of the Minneapolis Police Department, is African American. And yet you say that you still, and people there still do not trust the police. And obviously the institutional problem is much bigger than simply having an African American chief would solve, in your view.
Yes, and our AG, our Attorney General, is African American, and our Commissioner of Public Safety is African American, and we need them here. I'm very happy that this is the kind of leaders that we have in Minnesota, but apparently that's not enough. We also need action now. It was a day late and a penny short, and if you just fix Minneapolis, you don't fix the rest of the country. We're not going to do anything either. We need to really make a national change.
So what changes? I'm going to make you president for a day, Maya Santamaria. What do you believe is necessary to move not only your area of Minneapolis forward, but also the state of Minnesota and the country? What is necessary change?
Well, I suppose short term, you could do some legislation, right, that would support communities of color and come down against racism. But long term, I always say that the answer is education. Because when people become educated, then they become less racist. They become more tolerant, more progressive, and more, absolutely more tolerant of other cultures and other people different from themselves. And so long term, that would be investing in education, which unfortunately we have divested in for a long time now. And that ultimately will be what will bring us out of this dark era. But that is a long term project. And of course, it's fixing our children's generations to come, not those of us who are here now.
So, Ms. Santamaria, as we kind of wind down, and I appreciate you being so generous with your time and giving us a lot of exposition of everything that's going on there today, the last few days, this last week. If you were to encounter, and perhaps you have encountered at some point, the families of George Floyd or Derek Chauvin, what would you say to them each, respectively? What would you say to them about the situation that's going on, or what are your feelings about them going forward? How do you think about them?
I would give his wife, soon to be ex-wife, I'm talking about Chauvin's soon to be ex-wife, a big high five, because she's divorcing him over this. And I think that's a wonderful statement that she's making. Do you know her? I don't. I actually didn't know he was married because he was such a flirt, but not with me though. But now that I know that he's married to an ex Miss Minnesota 2018 Hmong woman, and she's a feminist and she works for women's rights. And the minute she saw the video, she called her attorney and filed for divorce. So I'd give her a high five. And probably her it was not his children that she had, it was her children, but I'd probably give them a very big healing hug. And to George's family, what can I say? I don't know them personally, but my attorney friend is in contact with them every day. He's a very big part of the African American community and was there at the healing ceremony for them today, or the memorial service. And I would just tell them that we are so sorry, and Minneapolis is with them and the country is with them, and that won't bring him back, but we're going to try to make his sacrifice something that meant something in this country, and we'll move the racial agenda forward in his name.
And I'm going to say this. I hope it's okay with you that I say this. Before the interview, I asked you about whether or not it would be okay to play a video of the incident that sparked everything, of the actual killing and the death of George Floyd. And your comment to me, I thought, was very interesting. You said the family has asked for, respectfully, folks not to play that video, not to spread that out. And I agreed with you that we wouldn't play it. And I thought I would ask you about that. Why is it that you feel it's important that we respect the family's perspective in all of this? And they're asking not only not to play the video, but just for the understanding that a family deserves in the time of loss that they're going through.
That was a horrible thing to watch. It was a disgrace. It was so hard to watch for me. And we're watching a man lose his life, not being able to breathe, begging for air, begging for mercy, and calling out his mama's name in his last breaths. That is one of the most intimate and humbling moments of a person's life. Our real last vestiges of humanity are seen in our last moments, especially under conditions, under that kind of duress. And if it were my son, I wouldn't want everybody to be watching him in those moments of distress as he loses his life either. It's way too public of of a thing to be sharing. It's an intimate thing to be sharing so publicly, even though it had to happen. We had to see it as a country. We also need to have respect for George and understand and realize that he was a person with loved ones, with family, with a past of wonderful things. You were telling me earlier that he was a great athlete, that people in Houston knew him and loved him for his athletic abilities and what he had done as an athlete there. And that's something that we have in common, is that Houston is another city that can claim George as his son. And I think that now that everyone has seen that horrible video, it'd be better not to repeat it again and let him rest in peace.
I feel compelled to ask you this question also, just in the spirit of what you said. How do you think about how our country right now deals with violence, how our culture treats this sort of thing? Have we lost our sensitivity to how significant these moments are, and how to treat moments like this? I mean, you mentioned this is an intimate moment, but yet it's all over the news. It's everywhere. Do you think this is a cultural problem that we face, or is it just George Floyd's situation, or is it a broader problem?
Well, we just saw Ahmaud get shot down as if we were, watching an animal being hunted. I mean, that was also disgusting and despicable. But culturally speaking, in the times of entertainment being a movie, watching everybody shoot each other up, and us going and paying $15 to go watch this for fun at a movie theater. At the times when video games that children have and play every single day is about shooting people and see how many people you can kill. We're so desensitized by this violence as a culture that, how are we to understand that this is actually a real human being? This isn't Hollywood and it's not a video game. These, put yourself in their place, or a family member of yours. It's incredible, but let's remember that this has always happened in this country. This country was built on racism. It's something that's been going on for over 500 years. It started with the Native Americans, and then the slave trade, was a horrible second chapter to our foundation of this country. First of all, this wasn't our land, and we raped and pillaged to steal it, and then we raped and pillaged some more to profit off of it on the backs of minorities and slaves. So I don't think it's anything different, but we have cell phones now, and people can defend themselves by doing Facebook Lives and recording things and reproducing them for the world to see. And that is actually the juxtaposition of now how we can start making change, is because that technology is enabling us to do things that we couldn't do in the past.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly helping with a conversation that it sounds like you're saying is a needed conversation, based on what I'm hearing you say. But as we kind of come to a close here, is there anything that you'd like to say to anyone that watches or listens to this, anyone that's watching all of this with curiosity, anything about George Floyd or Derek Chauvin or anything else that you want to cover?
Well, what I'd like to do is just ask people to support the Rebuild South Minneapolis GoFundMe account that the radio station, La Raza radio station, is putting together. We're
And where can they find that?
On the GoFundMe page, and you can also hopefully I'll send it to you so you can put it.
I'll put a link before
a link on this podcast, and certainly on my social media and the radio station La Raza 95.7 FM and 1400 AM. On our social media, you'll be able to see it as well. That the money that we are raising will go directly to the minority businesses that were meeting with us today that were looted and have been affected financially and didn't have insurance and don't have resources. And it's in order for them to be able to recover, and hopefully Lake Street can one day again be that vibrant, beautiful commercial corridor that it once was.
Maya Santamaria, a radio station owner, as well as the former owner of El Nuevo Rodeo, where both George Floyd and the officer who's alleged to have killed him, now charged with murder, Derek Chauvin, worked, and you live and work in South Minneapolis, where all of the violent protests and riots are happening, even now. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And that was Maya Santamaria, a Latino business owner in Minneapolis who employed both George Floyd and the officer alleged to have killed him, Derek Chauvin. If you like the show, please subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. And if you have an idea for a guest or want to be one, email me at jessfieldshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.